Hello, my name is Izaak Lauer. I'm a senior software engineer on the Waypoint team, and I'm going to be talking to you today about Waypoint, specifically its capacity to serve as the missing abstraction between devs and deployments. So first, let's introduce our actors. We're talking about deployments. Deploying is the act of taking an app that's been produced by an app developer and getting it to run on some infrastructure, typically managed by infradevs. So you've got like a Flask app on one side, you've got a Kubernetes cluster on the other side, and deploying is getting those two parts to interact. Let's examine the problems with deploying from these two different perspectives, the app dev perspective and the infradev perspective. So first, let's introduce a fictional app dev. We have here Danielle. She's a senior software engineer. She's relatively new to this company, but this is not her first rodeo. She knows her way around a Flask app. And in fact, she's just finished one. It's a stateless little 12-factor app, and it's ready to go. She is ready to solve an actual company problem with it. It is time to deploy. But before we deploy, we've got to figure out what deploying means for this company. So Danielle goes, talks to coworkers, looks at other similar repos, reads documentation, and figures out that at this company, deploying means building a Docker container, pushing it up to and running it on a GKE Kubernetes cluster in GCP, releasing it behind a GCP load balancer, and orchestrating all of that through Circle CI. Great. One problem. Danielle doesn't know these tools. At Danielle's previous company, she was building DEBs, baking them into AMIs, deploying them onto EC2, releasing behind ALBs, and orchestrating it all through Jenkins. So Danielle knows the steps that she needs to do. She knows what the workflow looks like, but she doesn't know any of the tools. So step 2, learn the tools. Let's start by installing everything. Install Docker Desktop, install kubectl and configure that. Install gcloud, configure that. Read a bunch of docs. All these public tools they have a bunch of docs. It's a very deep rabbit hole. She's also going to look around for any private internal docs that the infra team may have published on how to pull this off. Inevitably, that's probably not going to cut it. She's probably going to have to ask for help from other app teams, maybe even engage infra directly for some sticky problems. But Danielle is a persistent, tenacious engineer, and given enough trial and error and more error, she is going to figure out what letters she needs to type into her terminal to get the app deployed onto some actual infrastructure. So we pulled that off. Are we done? Not done. This is in some parts where the real hard part begins. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this chain of commits. Now we need to figure out how to take those letters that we type locally and embed them in like a bash script inside a YAML file that is your typical CI pipeline that will get CI to run all of those steps to deploy on, say, a push to your main branch or a PR merge or something. This is the automation part of deploying, and it comes with its own pain and headaches. So Danielle's finished all that now. She's got the pipeline working, she's made the commits, and she thinks, wow, that is actually a pretty big body of secret knowledge that I just obtained to figure out how to do this. I had better write this down so I'm not the sole holder of it. So she writes a big doc that the rest of her team, she assumes will be able to use to operate the app in production. And now, at last, she figures she's done with her journey. She can go back to writing apps. But I have news for Danielle. Danielle, you're a DevOps engineer now. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. This is how a lot of us got our start. Those of us who work in the DevOps space, we were the one, bold, plucky engineer who was willing to figure this out for the first time. But for Danielle, who really wants to get back to writing apps, this isn't ideal. The first time the app breaks in production, she's probably going to be the first one who's tapped to go in and figure out how to do a rollback. The first time the pipeline needs to be patched, she's probably going to be the one to do it. She can do all she can with, docs and knowledge transfer. But in my experience, that kind of knowledge transfer is usually not 100% successful. It seems like there are usually one or two people on the team who are the YAML wizards, who are the DevOps people, who know how to wrangle the pipelines. So what were the problems from Danielle's perspective? She started being familiar with all the concepts on how to deploy an app, but she still had to do a bunch of learning. She spent a great deal of time not building her app, doing the thing that she's ostensibly paid to do and measured on doing well. She's going to have to continue spending a bunch of time percolating that knowledge throughout the rest of her team, and she is not looking forward to bootstrapping the next microservice. She knows what she's in for now to pull it off, and she knows it's not trivial. So, switching perspectives. Let's now look at this from an infrastructure engineer's perspective. I introduced Brennan, a cloud platform engineer. Brennan is an old hat. She's worked here for a number of years. She helped stand up all the initial infrastructure, knows it front to back. She manages the GKE clusters that the app teams all deploy into. She makes sure they're up to date, makes sure they're all, the workers are always reporting as ready. She also manages and maintains the logging infrastructure, includes a handful of Elasticsearch clusters. She does a lot of this through Terraform, and her fun side project is she's building a little security scanner tool that will prevent anyone from deploying a known vulnerability to production. So, what are Brennan's problems? Problem number one, teaching. That app developer from the last phase, Danielle, odds are she was not entirely successful at being self-sufficient. She probably asked for help many times along the way. Brennan would like to just get back to building her sweet container scanning tool, but she keeps getting dragged into Slack conversations to help debug failed deployment pipelines and help onboard new teams onto the platform that she maintains. Problem number two is infrastructure changes. Let's say it's time to change tools. Maybe we have to upgrade a Kubernetes cluster, which could mean changing the cluster URL. Maybe we're going to switch platforms from, say, GCP to AWS. Maybe AWS just gave us a sweetheart deal with a bunch of free ECS credits that the company would like to utilize as free compute. Maybe we want to introduce some new stage in the middle of the pipeline, like that security scanner tool. This is going to be a hard problem for a couple of reasons. The first hard part is that there is no central place where all of your infrastructure is declared from the app developer's perspective. All of those app developers wrote their own little bespoke pipelines. And for you to change all of them, you're going to have to go either reason about each one independently and make a PR and hope they merge it, or ask the app developers to migrate themselves. And odds are they might not take that well. The second problem is even more insidious. It might seem like the only place that's tightly coupled to the infrastructure is the automation, the CI pipelines, but actually, the app devs have tightly coupled themselves to the infrastructure. We asked them to, get up to speed with all the tools, and they did. They installed kubectl. They learned how to use it, how to type, how to blaze a path through that tool to figure out what they need to do to get their app up. And asking them to switch tools is going to be met with some resistance, because from their perspective, they're going to just have to learn how to do the same thing in a different way. So there's pain on both sides. Maybe let's examine what each side actually needs to think about how we can structure a solution. What does an app developer need? Developers need to build some kind of artifact, Docker container, VM image, what have you. They need to deploy it somewhere into some cloud. They need to get it running somewhere on real infrastructure. After that, they're probably going to want to inspect it. They're going to want to curl their deployment, make sure that it's responding as they expect. They're going to want to get its logs. They might want to exec into it from time to time to, debug a thorny issue. Eventually, when they're satisfied with it, they're going to want to release that deployment onto the internet or the intranet for real consumption. And for all of these things, they really don't have strong opinions on how. As long as the workflows that are provided are relatively straightforward and are fast and snappy, they're going to be happy with it because they really just want to get back to writing their apps. Now, what do infradevs need? Infradevs are tasked in most organizations with selecting and operating the best, most secure, fastest, most efficient, what have you, infrastructure for the company at any given time. And infrastructure these days is a very fast-moving place. So those tools are going to change. And when the tools change, the infradevs need to have a way to switch them to a more appropriate tool or a better tool or a cheaper tool without burning all their political capital running around convincing all of the app developers to migrate to. And they also want to help app developers, the infradevs, spend their time managing their applications and not dealing with the infrastructure. The infradevs they want to help use their knowledge to prevent app devs from figuring all this out themselves. There's a reason that we generally don't give app developers just the keys to a new AWS account and say, go for it, build it from scratch. We want to save them some time, and we also want to encode some best practices to make sure these things are done the right way. So this brings us to the missing abstraction layer. It seems like an abstraction layer is what we need. We need something that sits between the developers and the actual infrastructure. Something that presents the developers with an interface that allows them to do the things that they care about without exposing too much detail, that lets them build, deploy, and release. On the other side, we need this abstraction layer to expose the full complexity of the infrastructure to the infradevs and allow infradevs to unplug and plug infrastructure into it to give developers a unified experience no matter what infrastructure you're on. So now that we've defined this problem, that we need some kind of an abstraction layer here, I introduce HashiCorp Waypoint. So what is Waypoint? Waypoint is an open source project at HashiCorp with an aim to address this problem. And let's talk about it from these two perspectives. Let's start with the app dev perspective. Waypoint for app devs provides a single interface that allows developers to perform the actions that they care about. It has commands to build, deploy, and release apps. It also exposes commands like logs, where developers can get a live view of their application logs, and exec to get a shell session into their running instances. It also it presents the developers with the information that they care about. So like when they deploy, it gives them a URL that they can use to reach that deployment. It also gives them a high-level summary of the status of the resources that are actually being created in the infrastructure, but it doesn't rub their noses in like all of the nitty-gritty details of exactly what's going on down there. Waypoint has a CLI that exposes the build, deploy, release commands. It also has a unified up command, so developers can run Waypoint up, and it'll take any code changes that they have all the way out to production and release. The CLI can also take advantage of the fact that it's often being run from the directory that the code lives in. So you can do things like deploy an exploratory change without having to first push your code to main. Waypoint also has a UI, which lets you perform many of the same actions as the CLI, but also gives you some visibility into like who deployed what when and what the status of all your deployments are at a quick glance. All right, now let's switch gears. Let's talk about infradevs. What do we have for them? Underneath the shiny build, deploy, release workflow, Waypoint lets infradevs configure what each of these actions means in the context of their organization. And because every organization has different needs and runs a different suite of technologies, the infrastructure layer in Waypoint is very pluggable. It works great with all the HashiCorp tools, the Hashi stack of Nomad, Consul, Vault, etc. But it also works with a wide variety of other infrastructure providers and platforms like Kubernetes and AWS Lambda and Google Cloud Run. So how do infradevs configure Waypoint? The first layer is through the waypoint.hcl file. You can see that the first line of this file is build. Everything inside that build stanza is the instructions on how to build the app. In this example, we're building with Docker and we're pushing to a Docker registry. I'm sorry, we're building with Pack and we're pushing to a Docker registry. Get this out of the way. Every app in Waypoint gets its own Waypoint HCL file, which can give you the flexibility to have different infrastructure behavior per app, if that's what you need. Where does this file live? It depends on the org. For some orgs, they prefer this file to be primarily owned by the app developers. And for them, they can commit this file directly to the app repo and Waypoint will read it from there. For orgs that want a harder abstraction layer between the app devs and the infrastructure, this file, the Waypoint HCL file, can be stored on the Waypoint server in the domain of the infradevs. Now let's talk about the next layer, plugins. For orgs that need a lot of flexibility, more than can be provided through the configuration in Waypoint HCL, Waypoint has a plugin system that allows you to write Go plugins that can give you exactly the behavior that you want. The plugin system in Waypoint is very deeply ingrained. Every interaction, in fact, with the infrastructure in Waypoint is handled and mediated through a plugin. Waypoint ships with over 30 plugins built in, but if you're a platform engineering group and you need a very specific deployment workflow, or if you need to target some custom infrastructure that Waypoint doesn't ship with support with, you can write a Waypoint plugin that defines exactly what deploy means for your organization. And that's a brief introduction to Waypoint. Let's pivot now to a demo and show some of this in practice.
All right, time for a demo.
I'm going to show you how you can use Waypoint in practice to be that abstraction layer between developers and deployments. Specifically, we're going to take an app, we're going to use Waypoint to deploy it onto one platform, in this case, AWS ECS, and then we're going to change the infrastructure out from underneath. We're going to migrate over to Kubernetes without the developer having to change their workflow or really even be aware of the change at all. So I've got here 2 different hats. I've got an app developer hat and an Infradev hat that I'm going to be switching between to show which persona I'm embodying at any given moment. I also have 2 terminals here. I've got an app dev terminal up here, Infradev down here. And with that, let's dive right in. So I am an app developer and I have produced an application. Let's go look at it. It is your basic Node.js web server. Not a whole lot going on with it. The interesting thing to note here is that there's nothing in this repo that is tied to any infrastructure. There's no Docker file, there's no Kubernetes manifest, there's no pipeline YAML, nothing. The only thing in here is files that I, as an app developer, would know that I need to include because they're the files that are necessary to make the app work, to run the app locally. I've tested it. It works great, and I'm ready to put it out on some real infrastructure. Platform engineer can have some help. Infradev hat on. Yes, we're going to deploy this thing. So to do that, we're going to use Waypoint. I have done a little bit of pre-work here. I've installed a Waypoint server onto an ECS cluster. I've set up a remote runner and a runner profile. We have docs on how to do that. I'm not going to dive into it now. And let's get right to it. Let's create a new project. This is going to be called HashiTalk. I'm going to connect it to a Git repository. This is where the code lives. I need to tell Waypoint so it can build and deploy the code. No authentication here. It's a public repo, but you could certainly do this with a private repo. And importantly, I'm going to set this to have Waypoint config live in the Waypoint server, not in the app repo. And I have also pre-made just a little bit of Waypoint config. So this is a pretty basic one. We're going to build using build packs. We're going to use a Docker registry to push the image that we create to the Docker image, and then we're going to deploy onto AWS ECS. This is just some basic config. I'm going to do it in USS1 with this much memory. This is a deep rabbit hole. There's a ton of config you can use for ECS to make this work exactly the way you need to for your org. Paste this in here, and we're good to go. And that is pretty much all we need from the app developer's perspective. We can invite from the Infradev perspective, we can invite the app dev to Waypoint, cut a Waypoint user for them. We're going to assume that's already done. They've already installed the CLI. Switching contexts. All right. I am the app dev. I am going to, and I'm ready to deploy. I'm going to run Waypoint up dash project equals HashiTalk. And actually, I'm going to wait until this initialization is done. I'll warn you. There we go. The weather in US West 1 is not great today. I think it's taken ECS a while to spawn tasks, so we might have to fast forward through some bits. But now we're ready. Here we go. Waypoint up, and here we go. It is kicking off a job. What are we waiting for here? What we are waiting for is for Waypoint to launch a separate ECS task that is going to perform the build for us, the build and the deploy and the release. Again, this is the all-in-one up command. It's going to take the thing all the way out to the internet. There are a lot of benefits to doing it this way instead of doing the build on my laptop. One is I don't have to have anything installed or configured at all. I don't have any reference to, I don't have the AWS CLI installed here. I don't even have AWS credentials, period. This is all happening through, AWS role and policy auth from the instance that is executing this in ECS. It's a consistent environment, so you can bring a new app developer in and it'll just work for them. I can throw more resources at it if I want to by making bigger ECS tasks to make the build faster. It's more secure. This is a nice way to do it. And it's using Kaneko because it's in a container, and it will finish in just a minute here. I will also warn you, Node.js pack builds are not the fastest thing in the world. So we might have to just speed through this. While we're waiting though, let's pop over here and look at what this looks like in the UI. We have a build that's running in the UI. We can inspect it. You can see the build logs here in the UI and see what's happening. Anybody on your team can view this to figure out what's going on. And let's now just speed ahead until this is complete. All right, wow, that was fast. We're already deploying and we are now releasing and we're done. So now I, the app dev, I have a release URL that I can use to hit the running instance. I've got a deployment URL. This says it's complete. It says it's deployed and released over here. Let's pop up one level and see what that looks like. Here's my deployment. It says it's in a degraded state right now because it hasn't passed its first health check yet. That'll happen in just a second. And let's give this a second actually to finish coming up all the way. I'm gonna rerun the health check, and we'll check back in when it's actually up. And we're up. It's now showing me that we have some resources that it created inside ECS. It shows me the task, the cluster, and the service. It's showing me the logs here. I can also get the logs in the CLI over here. If I run Waypoint logs, it'll give me the live logs. I, the app dev, am now confident this is working as I expected. I can also use this deployment URL to inspect this deployment in particular. Hooray, my app is up. It's on the internet. Life is good. Time to switch hats. I am now an Infradev again, and I have decided, or it's been handed down or whatever, we are moving. We're switching infrastructure. We're moving to Kubernetes. Maybe I just learned about Kubernetes. Maybe I'm tired of slow tasks in US West 1. But for whatever reason, that's what we're doing. And I'm going to have to do two things to pull this off. So the first thing I'm going to do is reconfigure this app to deploy to Kubernetes instead of ECS. And to do that, all I'm going to have to do is change this deploy stanza. I've got this ready. I have this deploy stanza down here. The one interesting thing I'm doing here is telling it to use this demo team namespace, just to show there's nothing up my sleeves. Ugh. Here I'm connected to the Kubernetes cluster I'm going to use. Here's my namespace. There's nothing in it yet. And I would like to deploy in here now instead of into an ECS cluster. The other thing I'm going to have to do, that I'm going to want to do, is change it so that the operations themselves, the Waypoint operations, build, deploy, release, that those execute on Kubernetes jobs instead of ECS tasks. The benefit of doing it here in Kubernetes is that I can then use Kubernetes service account auth instead of having to like take a kube config and give that over to my ECS runner. It's more secure. It'll also be faster. And to do that, I'm going to use Waypoint runner profiles. So I have two runner profiles here that I've already made, the ECS one and the Kubernetes one, that are targeting their respective runners. And the ECS one is the default. I'm going to switch the Kubernetes one to be the default. So ECS, default false. Kubernetes, default true. This is simulating like an org-wide switch to Kubernetes. You could also do this piecemeal. You could target Kubernetes in this specific for this specific application if you wanted to. And that's it. That is all I have to do as the Infradev. Let's go put our app dev hat back on and see what that looks like. I'm the app dev. I've made a change to the app. I've pushed it. I would like to redeploy. I'm just going to run Waypoint up again. Let's see what happens. So it looks like it's happening on Kubernetes now. Not that I need to know. We're building. Let's just real quick, let's put the Infradev hat on and see what this looks like in the infrastructure. If I get pods, I've installed the runner into the default namespace. So here in the default namespace, you can see here's this task running. This is the task that's actually performing this build that's going on right now. Let's pop back over to the UI, look at the build, currently building. And then let's put the app dev hat back on and just wait until this is done. Should be just a minute. There we go. Build is complete. We're releasing, and we're up. And here we go. I've got a deployment URL. I've got another release URL. I can inspect this again, make sure it's working. Let's show that logs and execs still work the way I'd expect. Logs still look good. And if I was a really nosy app dev and really wanted to know what's going on, let's say I'm going to use the exec functionality to get in here. Let's say I'm like, I want to poke around the container, make sure it's working. You can disable this for you if you want for your org. But in here, I can run the hostname command. And that is not an EC2 style hostname. That's a Kubernetes hostname. We did it. We deployed the app on Kubernetes, and I, the app dev, didn't have to change my workflows or knowledge at all. And that's the demo. All right. And that is the talk. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Waypoint, you can go to waypointproject.io. If you'd like to poke around through the code, or you want to think about writing a plugin or really want to dig in, github.com/HashiCorp Waypoint. It's open source. My name again is Izaak Lauer, and it was great speaking with you.